Welcome to the LI Law Podcast. We feature legal issues and developments which affect Long Island residents and business owners. I am your host, Zahava Schechter. Our guest on this 62nd episode is Rachel Silverstein, a 2020 Touro Law Center graduate and GLAAD-nominated comic book writer. Her first co-written graphic novel, Renegade Rule, was published by Dark Horse Comics in 2021. Please check out the show notes for more information about Rachel. Please keep in mind that we will not be providing legal advice to any specific questions. So let's get started. Rachel, before we met, I had never heard of the comic book law specialty. Please tell our listeners about this area of law.
Right. Hi, Zahava. Thank you for having me. So with comic book law, it was one of those things that I had also never heard of until I started getting into the comic book scene. And I thought to myself, once I started getting published by bigger name publishers, I said, who's going to look over my contract? I know as a law student, I could definitely look over it myself, which I did. And I thought, what kind of attorney do I give this contract to have them look it over and say it's either good or bad or needs changes? And that's when I learned about comic book law, which some people say isn't a real thing. It's a mix of a bunch of different types of law, entertainment law or contracts or intellectual property. And that's how I stumbled into the field.
So let me ask you about comic book law. Are we talking about the comic strips we see in the newspaper? Are we talking about Superman or Batman or those kind of hero figure books? Or is there really a spectrum of what is encapsulated within comic book law?
Right. So yes, it can be superheroes and all of that kind of stuff. It really has to do with, I think, the creative team and what the creative team is looking for. So it could be between maybe a writer and an artist, or maybe the writer and artist and the publishing company. So it's contracts between those types of people.
And what's interesting about comic book law, we know about many genres of novels, of romance novels, historical fiction, biographies, etc. Are there many publishing houses that deal with comic books or series involving comic books, or is the field more succinct?
I think that it's comic books in general, but of course there's also, like you said, novels and other kind of books, children's books, and pretty much any of that kind of media needs not necessarily a comic book lawyer, but I think an attorney to look over contracts in general.
And when we talk about comic books, are we talking about illustrated pictures, or are we talking mainly about text? Can you give us a better description?
Sure. At least for me, comic books is words plus art. And I mean, with the words, it could be the writer, it could be the letterer for the comic book. So there's a lot of different contracts that go on with making a comic book.
Okay, so first we're going to talk about how to help people who are looking to get into the field. So if you are one of our listeners is out there and wants to write comic books, we will definitely have advice for you. But we're going to start with the best way for practicing attorneys who may want to go into this field, start this field. What's the best way for them to learn about comic book law?
Right. So actually, this is kind of cool and near and dear to my heart, but it's one of those things that as a law student, I couldn't take full advantage of. But there are CLEs that are dedicated just to comic book law.
Continuing legal education programs. Yes.
Yes. And some of them I couldn't attend as a law student, but there are ones that are offered every year, I think every year, at New York Comic Con. And it's literally about comic book law and everything that we've just talked about, having to do with intellectual property, copywriting, your comic books and trademarking your logos and all that kind of stuff.
Well, we're going to get into that a little bit later. I believe that there is a book you want to mention which deals with comic book law. And I want to tell all of our listeners, all of the sites, all of the books and the cases and the articles which Rachel is referring to, all those sites will be in the show notes. So please look at the show notes if you want further illustration. But is there a source for lawyers to go to if they want to start this field?
Yeah, so it's called the Pocket Lawyer for Comic Book Creators. So not only is it beneficial to lawyers to look at, so they have a background, it's also beneficial to obviously comic book creators who have no legal background. And I have the book, it spells out everything for you in different chapters and everything like that. And one of the writers for it gave a talk at Torah Law School. I invited him to give a little talk at the Intellectual Property Law Society. So that was a lot of fun.
That is nice. And I understand you also present at libraries or other facilities. So if anyone's interested in speaking with you about coming to their facility or their school and talking about this, I'm sure you're available. And Rachel's contact information is in the show notes. So from where does your inspiration come to create your comic books?
Right. So it really started probably when I was in middle school. I got into comic books and, superheroes were big back then. So that's what I was into. And then over time, I started a writer's notebook back when I was in high school. I wrote the date when I started. It was 2009, and I think it's halfway full. It was a big book.
What is a writer's notebook?
Yeah, I just jot down little ideas. Back then it was, angsty poems when I was in high school and stuff like that. But now I write out either my comic book ideas. I did a recent comic book that's being published at the end of the year that I wrote out the entire first draft of it in my writer's notebook. So no one look at it because it's all confidential. But
what is the name of that book?
Right. So that's called The Legend of Korra, Patterns in Time. It's an anthology for, if anyone's a fan of the Avatar: The Last Airbender series that was on Nickelodeon a long time ago. It's the sequel, Legend of Korra. And yeah, they came out with a comic book anthology that I contributed a short story to.
Okay. And let's talk about Renegade Rule, your first published book. Congratulations on that. What is that about, and how do interested listeners find your book?
Right. So Renegade Rule is near and dear to my heart. It's my first ever published comic book with Dark Horse Comics. I wrote it with my co-writer, Ben Kahn, and they approached me and said, "Hey, Rachel, I know you've always wanted to break into the comic book scene." They had always published comics in the past, and said, "How would you feel about writing a comic book about women on a virtual reality esports team?" I said, "Yeah, let's do it." So it took a long time. We originally self-published it back in 2018, the first chapter of it. We got picked up by Dark Horse Comics, and
that's the publisher, correct?
The publisher, yes.
Yep.
And we ended up making it into a 96-page graphic novel. And it's about queer girls on a virtual reality esports team fighting their way to the top of the championship finals. And it was a lot of fun. It's definitely for ages 16 and older, I would say. And it's really funny if anyone's interested.
Okay. And do you have a literary agent?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So how does someone who's interested in writing a comic, and I want to ask you the difference between a graphic novel and a comic book, maybe it's the same thing, I'm not sure, but what is the difference? And then how does someone who wants to write one of those types of books find a literary agent in this specialty?
Right. So the difference is a comic book is really, like I said earlier, words and art, and it could be a comic strip that's collected in a book. It could be a single issue comic book, like a lot of the superhero comics are like that. You buy one issue at a time and they're all numbered. And a graphic novel is either, like with Renegade Rule, we call it an OGN, an original graphic novel, where it's just one story that's many pages long.
And what is the graphic component here?
The art.
Oh, the art. Okay,
right.
Very good.
So
and how do you find a literary agent who knows what he or she is doing in this genre?
Right. So, I mean, the easiest way is to just honestly Google literary agents in comic books, and there are ones who specialize just in comic books.
Are there many? Are there many who do?
I honestly haven't researched it too much. Our literary agent is the best, and she
Who
really
is
looks
your
out for
agent?
us.
Who is your agent?
Oh, her name is, you think I would know it off the top of my head,
All
Mo
right.
Ferreira.
Okay, very
Yeah.
good. All right. So, Rachel, now we're going to get to our listeners' questions. Maybe they are burning with the desire to publish a graphic novel. So what are 3 tips you would give to our listeners who want to follow in this path?
Right. So the first tip that I would give, and I will preface by saying I'm not an attorney, but I do have experience in all of the law school classes that I took. But I would say first, copyright and trademark everything. I think that is super important so that people don't come after you.
Okay, so
Or you
what
don't
does
come
that
after.
mean? What
Right.
are the differences? What does that mean?
So a copyright is protecting original works of authorship. And I think the full definition is that it has to be a tangible work or a fixation in a tangible form.
How do you copyright your work?
Right. So there is the Copyright Office. It's
In Washington,
right.
D.C.?
Right. And you file for it online. You can have an attorney file it for you. You can do it by yourself. And yeah, they slap a copyright on it and it's yours.
Wonderful. And so no one can infringe on that. No one can then take part of what you wrote and make it as if it's his or her own.
Correct.
What is a trademark, and
right.
why is that important?
So a trademark is any word or phrase or logo or symbol or design or all of those things that is a way to basically make your, let's call it a logo, make your logo distinct and make it yours. So that's also similar. You file your trademark with the US Patent and Trademark Office, and then that becomes yours.
What happens if you don't get a copyright or trademark, and then later someone takes your part of your work and pretends that it's his or hers? What can you do to gain the rights at that point, or is it too late?
Right. And I know that happens often. I remember learning about that in class where like in intellectual property classes, I took copyright law classes. And I know for copyrights, you still have protection even without copywriting something. But a lot of it has to do with did you make it yours? Are people going to look at your copyright or your trademark and say, okay, I associate this with Rachel, for me, for example. If I didn't trademark Renegade Rule, the logo, will they still associate it with our comic book? So even without trademarking or copywriting, you can still say, well, there is an association, and that kind of overcomes the copyright or lack of copyright. So there is still some protection, but I think that it's a lot harder to fight for it without it.
So it's better to handle the copyright and trademark issues right away. Okay, so that's your first tip. What's your second tip?
Right. So my second tip has to do with comic book creators in general, and that is have a contract with everyone. Have a contract if you're a writer, have it with your letterer and your artist. Make sure, obviously, you have a contract with your publisher. And I mean, if you, let's just say I go in to write a comic book with you and you're the artist and I'm the writer, and we're like, okay, let's just do this. We're gonna, split the money even, or I'll pay for you or whatever. And then 10 years from now, we absolutely hate each other. There's no contract to say, okay, well, I'm getting these royalties and you're getting these royalties. So it makes things difficult. And then you have to go through litigation if it gets to that point. And, if you have a contract from the beginning, it takes away from all of that.
So put everything in writing. Good suggestion. Okay. And what's your third tip?
My third, find an intellectual property law firm that will handle pretty much everything I said above. A lot of it is hard to do on your own, especially if you're not maybe well-versed in the intellectual property law or entertainment law fields. I think it's, it'll cost some money, but it's easier to just have someone do it for you and do it right.
Right. I think you're right. And if anyone has questions or would like to contact Rachel about her ideas, please feel free to look at the show notes, and her contact info is there. So Rachel, you've written 2 law review articles about comic book law. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the first one?
Sure. So these were very fun to write. The first one, I came up with this idea. I said, how can I incorporate comic books into the law? And I knew nothing. So I went on Westlaw and I looked up comic book law. That's all I searched. And there was an ALR that I found that had to do with basically obscenity and how it related to comic books. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what other cases have to do with that and whatnot. So my first law review article is it's called The Law of Obscenity in Comic Books. And it looks at the First Amendment and different types of comic book stores is really what it's about, and how comic book stores have sold legally obscene comic books to either minors or just even having them on the shelves. And it's technically illegal. So a lot of the shop owners would be arrested, and many of them tried to fight for their rights.
That's interesting, because when you think of other publications, magazines, which have very, sexual related material, they're allowed on on many shelves, right? So what is the difference between a comic book? Is it an age issue that children are not supposed to access this material?
Yes, that's pretty much it. And it's not, also one of the things that I wrote about is it's not just pornography. It could also be graphic depictions of violence and war and things like that, that could legally be deemed obscene. The one thing that
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
The one thing that I focused on a lot in my article, and I wrote about it in like my first sentence, there was a famous quote by Justice Potter Stewart, and he wrote, "I know it when I see it," when he talked about obscenity, which I always thought was crazy, because there really wasn't a law about, well, what is obscene, and everyone
no
will
definition.
have right, and
no
everyone will have
definition.
their different opinion on what's they deem obscene.
Mhm.
The right now in the law, the most like cited case, I guess, is the Miller versus California, which came out with the Miller test. And basically, in short, it's the community standard. What would the community deem obscene? That would, I mean, this one more has to do with porn, and so it has to do with the prurient interests and basically like what not type of sexuality in terms of like LGBT, but sexuality in terms of sex.
But I just want to say the standards in New York may be very different from the standards in, I don't want to pick on Utah or Wyoming, but there are, in other states which are more conservative. So you do bring up a good point about how we need a greater standard, but I think we'll have to wait for the Supreme Court to come up with something better on that. And tell us about your second article.
Right. So my second article was called, it's a little bit longer. It's called Comic Books, the First Amendment, and the Best Test for Right of Publicity Issues. So both of these articles I published in the Torah Law Review while I was in law school. And this one has to do with more intellectual property laws, which was a little more up my alley, although it was fun learning about obscenity laws. So this one focused on lawsuits between comic book publishers or like a writer or artist. And basically they put what I called persons of interest, whether it be celebrities or even just regular people who didn't approve of having their likeness being used in a comic book. And they brought suit against the publisher or the comic book writer or artist.
So I just want to clarify, we're talking about a famous personality whose likeness is used without his or her consent in a comic book framework. Is that correct?
Correct.
So yeah, doesn't that celebrity have a right to privacy? Is that something discussed here? And what did the court find there?
Right. So there are a couple cases. There were two kind of opposing cases. There was one, Winter versus DC Comics. This was in a Jonah Hex comic book. And there were basically Johnny and Edgar Winter, who are famous musicians. And they claimed that their likeness was used in this Jonah Hex comic book. And the court said that they were described as the Autumn Brothers, so kind of a play on their names allegedly. And they were depicted as half worm, half humans, but also allegedly resembled the Winter Brothers. So here the court actually found that, and I wrote this down, DC Comics depicted fanciful, creative characters not pictures of the Winter brothers. And I quote, "This makes all the difference." So basically the court said that they changed the, I guess it wasn't depictions of them, but they changed the characters enough where they said, "This isn't the Winter brothers, these are the Autumn brothers."
I don't know, that seems very specious to me. It seems if you can connect a personality with a caricature, it might damage your brand or your how you're perceived by members of the public. But so basically, I think the court is not extending the right to privacy to public figures, right? If you're out in the public and you're well known, any comic book writer can make a book about you. Is that the moral of the story here?
Actually, no. So in another case that I had read about and I wrote about, this one had to do with, and I'll just say it quickly, but it had to do with Tony Twist, the famous hockey player. He was a part of the NHL, and they found that in the Spawn comics published by Image Comics, that they completely used his likeness. Not only was he a hockey player, they made him into a supervillain who murdered people, and I think Image Comics took it one step further, where they, or I guess the writer, but they made merchandise, hockey merchandise, that obviously had, you know that had to be about Tony Twist. So
Right,
he
right.
actually won that lawsuit.
I would think because they're making money off of additional merchandise, but also I think a difference, and tell me if I'm wrong, is here Tony is perceived as a violent character, where
Right.
maybe in the Winter Brothers caricature there was no violence. So maybe that's another distinguishing factor. But it seems to me that it's so fact specific in each case that there is no guideline here. It's basically based on the facts, and good luck to you in
Right.
suing.
And that's what I tried to come up with, was what I called the best test. There were many tests that I saw. I think there were 5 or 6 tests for persons of interest and right of publicity issues. So my test came up with basically a reasonable trier of fact, finding that the person's persona, commercial value, was substantially transformed as a whole rather than as minimal elements. And I thought that would be a little more all-encompassing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly a very specific area of law, and I would think that anyone who, whether an attorney is listening or a law student or someone just interested in the field, someone would find a lot of interesting material. So as a recent law school graduate, Rachel, do you have any advice, whether for current law students or for attorneys or for anyone else who might want to learn more about the comic book law field?
Right. So I think during law school, and maybe with CLEs if they're offered, definitely a drafting contracts class. That's obviously very important in comic book law. Entertainment law classes, if that's available, or CLEs. And then something that I did personally, I don't know if I can plug it, but I took summer classes at University of New Hampshire Law, and their law school focused primarily on intellectual property law. So one summer I took 3 classes and got school credit for it, and they were really interesting.
Were those online classes?
Yes.
So it's more available to people throughout the country to do that. So Rachel, do you have any future plans in the comic book law field?
Right. So comic book law is kind of a niche field to get into, and it's always been my end goal to get into it once I pass the bar. So that's kind of my plan at the moment. And then of course, publishing more comic books. That's also a side hustle for me. So that's one of my other plans. And also I just want to say that if there are any comic book creators, creative teams, or anyone like that who is looking for someone to look over their contracts, feel free to reach out to me and I can look them over or set you up with an attorney who will oversee everything.
That's very kind of you. And I'm going to give you a plug, which we're going to put in the show notes as well, about your Etsy page. You're so creative in every way and creating all kinds of jewelry and other items. So we see a great deal of creativity coming from you, Rachel. I look forward to your next book. And that's it for our 60-second episode. Thank you, Rachel Silverstein, for coming on the podcast today. The LI Law Podcast keeps you updated on Long Island legal matters and is your podcast for local legal tips which educate and entertain. Thanks for listening.